Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving into a topic that, well, it really touches on biology, psychology, societal norms, and even the very nature of how we do science. It's the intricate landscape of gender identity and all the related discussions. We've gathered a pretty fascinating stack of sources here, from critical looks at academic integrity to deep dives into medical outcomes, and even how basic biological definitions sort of intersect with evolving social ideas. Our mission: to pull out the most important nuggets, cut through some of the noise, and help you get truly well informed on this really multifaceted subject.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here is how deeply interconnected all these different threads are. We're not just talking about individual experiences, though those are crucial, of course. We're also looking at the scientific methods used to understand them, the ethical questions in medicine, and the bigger societal implications that shape how we see human identity. It really brings up a key question, doesn't it? How do we balance compassion and inclusivity with, rigorous scientific scrutiny and established biological facts?
Exactly. So, where do we even start with something so sensitive, so often polarized? We decided to begin at the foundation: academic integrity itself. How we even know what we know. Our sources bring up a really striking example: the grievance studies affair back in 2017, right? This was the trio of academics Bogosian, Lindsay, and Pluckrose who submitted fake papers to journals. And these weren't subtle fakes either. Some had truly outrageous claims, like one arguing dogs engage in rape culture, or even rewriting parts of Mein Kampf with feminist buzzwords. Their stated goal was to expose what they saw as, well, flaws in certain academic fields, particularly gender studies, queer theory, fat studies.
Indeed. And the whole thing started to unravel around October 2018, didn't it? When journalists exposed one of the fictional authors. Before it all came out, they actually got 4 papers published out of the 20 they submitted. And the reactions were predictably polarized. Some praised them for highlighting potential issues. Others strongly condemned their methods as unethical, a breach of trust. It really does make you ask, can absurdity actually pass for legitimate inquiry in some academic circles? There was that quote from Steven Pinker, something like, "Is there any idea so outlandish that it won't be published?" It definitely flags concerns about the peer review process. I mean, it's meant to be a quality safeguard, but here it seemed, well, vulnerable.
Yeah, it really makes you think about trust in academia, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And our sources point out this isn't necessarily confined to just those fields. They suggest potential issues exist more broadly, maybe where ideologically driven claims can creep into scientific discussion. One example mentioned is the controversy around claims that biological males can become pregnant, which, goes against fundamental biology. So this whole affair kind of sets the stage for how we need to approach the information in this deep dive, carefully distinguishing genuine inquiry from, well, maybe manufactured absurdity.
Right, and with that critical lens in mind, let's connect it to the bigger picture, the need for clear definitions. Our sources really get into the foundational biological definitions. What is a human? What defines male and female biologically? From that purely biological perspective, a human is, well, fundamentally defined by our biology, a bipedal hominin. Specific anatomical traits, that 1,400 cubic centimeter brain capacity linked to our complex cognition, tool use, all that.
And then getting specific about male and female, it's rooted right there in the biology and the genetics. Male DNA typically carries an X and a Y chromosome. That Y chromosome is key for producing spermatozoa. Female DNA, typically 2 X chromosomes linked to producing ova and the potential to carry offspring. And these genetic differences are significant, aren't they? The Y has maybe 200 working genes, but it's crucial for male sex traits.
That SRY gene specifically.
Right. While the X chromosomes have around 1,000 genes influencing a much wider range of things in both sexes, this biological dichotomy, XY versus XX, is really foundational to understanding sex differences, separate from, social or political ideas about gender.
Absolutely. And it ties into the organism's overall function.
Mm.
Maureen Kondik, the neuroscientist, and her brother Samuel, a philosopher, they argue that this natural organization is key. It's about how all the parts cooperate for the whole entity's well-being. In humans, you see this integration in complex systems like neuroendocrine pathways. So from this strictly biological view, sex is an inherent characteristic defined by chromosomes, anatomy, physiology. That SRY gene on the Y chromosome you mentioned, it's like the master switch. It kicks off male development, leading to testes formation.
Mhm.
If there's no functional SRY gene, even in an XY individual, you can see development along female lines, like in Swyer syndrome.
Okay, so we have these foundational biological definitions of sex. How does gender identity fit in? Our sources make a clear distinction here. They acknowledge that while sex is biological, gender identity is about an individual's internal sense of being male, female, both, neither, somewhere else along the spectrum. It might not align with their biological sex, And historically, yeah, gender nonconformity was often seen as a disorder, pathologized. But there was a big shift in 2013 with the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual. They moved from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria.
Right, focusing on the distress.
Exactly. The focus shifted to the significant distress someone might feel due to that incongruence between their identity and their assigned sex. It wasn't about labeling the identity itself as a mental illness anymore. It was seen as a step towards, inclusivity and respect. Okay, so keeping that distinction, biological sex and internal gender identity in mind, let's move into the medical interventions people might consider. Starting with puberty blockers. These are medications designed to pause puberty, often used for transgender youth experiencing distress. But here's where it gets really interesting. There was a recent Mayo Clinic study. They looked at 877 boys aged 10 to 16. 16 identified as having gender dysphoria, and 9 of those were already on blockers. What did they find?
Well, the findings were, frankly, quite alarming, and they really challenged that common idea that these blockers are fully reversible. The study found evidence of testicular atrophy that's wasting away of the sex glands, ranging from mild to severe. For instance, one 12-year-old boy treated for just 14 months showed nearly 60% atrophy. And they found abnormal calcium clusters, which they noted could potentially be linked to later cancer risk.
Wow.
Even more concerning, a 14-year-old treated for over 4 years. His sample showed over 90% of the germ cells, the ones needed for sperm production, were developmentally arrested. This raises really serious questions about future fertility, and it also raises questions about informed consent, especially when some information sources, like Mayo Clinic's own website apparently, were still saying these blockers don't cause permanent physical changes.
That's a huge ethical consideration, isn't it? Especially dealing with minors and potentially irreversible effects. Okay, now let's talk about gender reassignment surgery, often called GRS. Our sources mention some reviews, like one from Birmingham University's Aggressive Research Intelligence Facility. They looked at over 100 follow-up studies on GRS outcomes. What was their conclusion?
Their conclusion was that there is insufficient conclusive evidence to support the benefits of GRS for patients. That's a really significant finding. It means despite common assumptions, the high-quality scientific proof for long-term benefits just isn't there in the research reviewed.
So not enough strong evidence.
Exactly. And similarly, back in 2016, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, here in the U.S., looked into covering GRS. They also found insufficient evidence, pointing to conflicting results and, frankly, low-quality data in many studies. In fact, they suggested that the methodologically sound research did not show substantial improvements in quality of life after GRS, even if some earlier studies or maybe self-reports seemed positive initially. So it really forces us to ask, how do we interpret these findings? What does insufficient evidence really mean for care?
Right. So if the long-term benefits aren't conclusively proven by these reviews, what do our sources say about long-term outcomes, particularly mental health? There's a big one mentioned. A comprehensive 30-year Swedish cohort study. What did that reveal?
Yes, that Swedish study is often cited, and its findings are, well, sobering. It found that mortality rates from cancer, specifically neoplasm and also cardiovascular diseases, were significantly elevated, about 2 to 2.5 times higher a decade after treatment compared to controls.
Higher mortality.
Yes. And maybe even more critically, the risk of needing psychiatric hospitalization was 2.8 times greater. And that was even after they adjusted for any pre-existing mental health conditions the individuals might have had.
Mm.
And the most alarming statistic, perhaps, suicide rates among those who had transitioned were 20 times higher than their non-transgender peers, looking 10, 15 years post-surgery. Male to female transgender individuals showed particularly high rates of attempted suicide in that study. It strongly suggests that surgical transition doesn't automatically fix underlying mental health issues or eliminate the need for ongoing psychiatric care.
Yeah.
The picture is much more complex.
That really is a stark contrast to how this is often presented. And then there's the issue of transgender regret or detransition. Our sources mention regret rates possibly being as high as 33% in some cohorts, though that number is debated. What factors might lead to regret?
Well, regret can stem from a whole mix of things. Social stigma that persists even after transition is one factor. Lack of support from family or community can be huge, and sometimes it's dissatisfaction with the physical results of the surgery. The psychological impact of regret can be really devastating, worsening feelings of isolation, anxiety, depression. The sources bring up the tragic case of David Reimer, though different circumstances, forced reassignment after a botched surgery. It highlights the profound psychological distress that can come from identity conflicts and societal pressures.
Yeah, a very tragic story.
It absolutely circles back to that question. Are we ensuring truly informed consent before people undergo irreversible procedures? Are all potential outcomes, including regret, being discussed?
And these outcomes, or maybe the lack of clear positive outcomes in some studies, also ties back to concerns about the research itself, right? Our sources point to significant methodological flaws in many studies looking at GRS outcomes. Can you elaborate on those?
Certainly. This is a critical point. Common problems include things like really small sample sizes in studies. Often there's no proper control group to compare against. There's often a heavy reliance on subjective, self-reported data, how someone feels they're doing. But maybe the biggest issue is participant loss to follow up.
People dropping out of the study.
Exactly. Sometimes more than half the participants are lost over time. And you have to ask, who are those people? Are they the ones who are doing poorly, perhaps experiencing regret or severe adverse effects, maybe even suicidal ideation? If they drop out, their negative outcomes might not get counted, which can skew the results to look much more positive than reality.
Right, painting an overly optimistic picture.
Precisely. It makes it incredibly hard to know if any initial improvements hold up long-term or if serious problems are being missed. We desperately need better quality long-term studies with large, diverse groups to really understand the full picture.
Okay, so given these research gaps and concerns, what alternative approaches do some critics propose? Dr. Paul McHugh was mentioned.
Yes. Dr. Paul McHugh, former psychiatrist in chief at Johns Hopkins. He's been a prominent voice here. He argues quite forcefully that, biologically, transition doesn't change sex. His phrasing is that individuals become feminized men or masculinized women, still tied to their natal biology. He advocates strongly for focusing first on understanding any underlying mental health conditions, prioritizing thorough psychological evaluation and psychotherapy before considering irreversible medical steps. And there is research, our sources note, suggesting that many individuals experiencing gender dysphoria can find greater self-acceptance regarding their birth sex through therapy without needing medical interventions.
So therapy first as a primary approach.
That's his perspective, yes. It raises that important question again. Are we creating spaces where people can safely explore their feelings and identities, get support, without feeling pressured towards a specific path, especially a medical one, right away?
This whole conversation definitely gets even more complex and, frankly, concerning when we focus on children. Our sources cite data suggesting over 5,700 children underwent gender-affirming surgeries in the U.S. over just a 5-year period, mainly concentrated in a few states. What are the core ethical worries there?
The absolute central ethical concern is about capacity for informed consent. Can minors, whose brains and understanding of long-term consequences are still developing, truly grasp the permanent nature of procedures like GRS or even the potential long-term effects of blockers we discussed? Critics argue that young people might make decisions during a period of intense identity exploration that they later deeply regret as adults. And then you have the whole politicization layer. Legislative actions trying to restrict access to care for minors, like the mention of the Trump administration's move against federal funding for pediatric transition, that creates a really divisive environment, which, ironically, can sometimes make things worse for transgender youth by potentially limiting access even to supportive psychological care, not just medical interventions.
Yeah, it's a minefield. And shifting gears slightly, what about the impact on sports? The case of Leah Thomas, the transgender swimmer, really pushed this debate into the mainstream consciousness. What do our sources say about fairness, especially in women's sports?
Right. The core of the debate is whether including transgender women who have gone through male puberty compromises the fairness of female sports categories. The sources we looked at argue pretty strongly that the physical advantages gained during male puberty, things like bone density, muscle mass, lung capacity, cardiovascular advantages, are not fully undone by hormone therapy alone.
So testosterone suppression isn't enough.
The studies cited suggest it only minimally reduces these deep-seated biological advantages. The swimming example is stark. Men, on average, outperform women by about 11% at elite levels historically. And Leah Thomas's times post-transition, while slightly slower than her best pre-transition times as a male competitor, were still significantly faster than her cisgender female competitors, illustrating that a considerable advantage likely remained. The point made isn't about Leah Thomas personally, but about whether the regulations themselves are flawed, perhaps based on outdated ideas about how long transition takes or what effects it truly has on performance metrics rooted in male puberty.
So it becomes a question of balancing inclusion with fair play.
Exactly. How do we maintain both? Maybe through different categories, maybe mixed gender events in some sports. It opens up a lot of complex questions about the structure of sport itself.
Okay, let's bring this all back to where we started that line between science and maybe something else. Our sources include this quite provocative statement. If a biologist is telling you about your feelings, they're not a biologist, they're an activist.
Hmm.
Can you unpack the nuance in that?
Yeah, that's a statement designed to make you think. It highlights a potential blurring of boundaries. A biologist's expertise is typically in objective, empirical stuff, genetics, anatomy, physiology,
Yeah.
measurable things, feelings, subjective experiences, identity alarms. Those are more the realm of psychology, sociology, or philosophy, perhaps. So when a scientist whose training is purely biological starts making definitive claims about someone's internal subjective state based solely on biology, they might be stepping outside their specific expertise. They risk oversimplifying really complex human experiences and potentially crossing into advocacy for a particular viewpoint rather than just stating biological facts.
And the financial angle complicates it too.
It can, yes. The sources mentioned the significant money involved transgender surgeries reportedly generating around $80 million annually. That inevitably raises questions about potential conflicts of interest for providers or institutions. And also, the pressure to secure research grants, maybe grants aimed at finding favorable outcomes for certain interventions, could subtly compromise objectivity. It boils down to this. Validating personal experiences is vital. Compassion is essential. But that needs to coexist with rigorous, objective scientific scrutiny, especially when irreversible medical decisions are on the table. The real challenge, then, is finding that line. Where does compassionate understanding meet objective scientific truth? And how do we navigate that intersection honestly?
Wow. Okay, that was definitely a deep dive into an incredibly complex, layered, and sensitive area. We've touched on academic integrity, the nuts and bolts of biological sex, the surprising and sometimes concerning outcomes of medical interventions, and grappled with the ripple effects on kids, on sports, and that tricky line between science and activism. It's abundantly clear there are no easy answers here, is there?
Not at all.
And getting multiple perspectives, making sure they're grounded in solid evidence, seems absolutely crucial for any real understanding.
Absolutely. And if we zoom out for a second, connect it to the bigger picture, it's really about critical thinking in a world saturated with information. This deep dive, I think, really underscores the need to look closely at research methods. Are there limitations? To question the assumptions underlying claims, and to be really careful about distinguishing between objective scientific findings and subjective personal experiences or even advocacy. Both have value, but they aren't the same thing. So maybe the final question isn't for us, but for you, the listener. In a world where compelling personal stories often grab the headlines, how will you make sure you're also seeking out the underlying data, the methodological critiques, and the diverse scientific viewpoints to build your own truly informed understanding of complex issues like this one?